buddies. Welcome back for chapters 7 and 8 of The Mouse and the Motorcycle. All right. Chapter 7, The Vacuum Cleaner. From his position under the bed, Ralph watched the tank of the vacuum cleaner being dragged in from the hall and listened to the clash and clang of the attachments as the maid connected the long metal tube to the nozzle at the end of the hose and fastened a carpet cleaning part to the end of the tube. He heard her humming to herself as she plugged in the deadly machine and began to work it back and forth across the carpet. It was nice she's so happy, thought Ralph bitterly, as he watched the hungry machine devour dust and lint that lay in its path. The maid's feet in white sneakers moved across the room until, without bothering to bend down to see what she was cleaning, she shoved the attachment under the bed. It slid closer and closer to Ralph. To be on the safe side, he pushed the motorcycle further from the reach of the machine, but he dared not take his eyes off the attachment for even a second. He shuddered as he watched it gobble the dust mouse, but even as he shuddered, he was fascinated by the power of the motor. The maid began to sing, "I'll give to you a paper of pins, for that's the way my love begins." The attachment fell off the end of the long tube, but the maid, whose thoughts were elsewhere, did not notice. Now Ralph could make the machine suck in its breath, and he knew he was in danger of being inhaled along with the dust mites. Recklessly, the maid pushed the open end of the tube back and forth any old way. There was no guessing which way it would go next. Ralph had to run with the motorcycle to avoid the terrifying hole at the end of the tube. He ran to the right, he ran to the left, and still the maid pushed the tube around, unaware that the attachment had fallen off. Suddenly, the maid threw down the tube, but did not turn off the motor. The tube landed with a bump and a bounce, and before Ralph realized what was happening, the awful machine had inhaled his tail, and he felt himself being pulled by the suction across the carpet. "Help!" He could not help from squeaking, but no one could hear him over the roar of the machine. He just managed to catch the rear wheel of the motorcycle as he was being sucked along the carpet. He hung on with all his strength. The machine, which was strong enough to suck on a mouse, was not strong enough to suck up a mouse and a motorcycle. Ralph lay there on his stomach, hanging on for dear life and feeling his whiskers and fur swept back towards the machine. From his position on his stomach, Ralph could see the girl standing in front of the dresser. She was smiling to herself in the mirror, arranging her hair, dreaming, no doubt, of the busboy. Ralph was despaired. There was no telling how long she would stand there in that silly way, and with the vacuum cleaner motor making so much noise, the housekeeper was sure to think she was busy working. Ralph felt his paws begin to slip. He didn't know how much longer he could hold on against the machine. He had to think of something and think of it fast. With every bit of strength he had left in his body, he clung to the wheels of the motorcycle with his left paw while he moved his right paw up to the exhaust pipe. If he could just manage to pull himself along until he could get on the motorcycle, bit by bit, hand over hand, Ralph dragged himself forward along the exhaust pipe. He knew he was making progress when he could see part of his tail once more. He reached back and yanked his tail out of the tube, only to have it sucked back in again. Ralph was far from being out of danger. "I'll give to you the keys to my heart," the maid sang to herself before the mirror, now pulling her hair behind her ears, now piling on top of her head, oblivious to the desperate struggle under the bed. Once, Ralph's paw slipped from the exhaust pipe and he thought he was a goner until he caught the rear wheel just in time to save himself. Slowly, he moved forward until his entire tail was free. Things were easier when he could brace his hind foot against the spokes of the rear wheel. Slowly he rose, clinging to the machine, until he was able to grasp the hand grips and throw his leg over the seat. Ralph felt considerably safer sitting on the motorcycle and was very much pleased with himself for having outwitted the vacuum cleaner. He was quite sure by now that the maid had not to bother look under the bed. He tried to move forward, propelling the cycle with his feet, but he found that the suction from the motor behind him was too strong. It made him wonder if the motor on Keith's cycle was stronger than the pull of the machine behind him. The more Ralph thought about it, the more important it seemed to him to find out. "No, I won't. Yes, I will," Ralph argued with himself. He'd promised not to ride in the daytime. Yes, but Keith didn't know that he would have a chance to see which was stronger, the motorcycle or the vacuum cleaner. Keith would be interested, wouldn't he? Wouldn't any boy? Riding the motorcycle would not be reckless. It would be an interesting experiment. Motorcycle versus vacuum cleaner. Who would be the winner? Ralph had to find out. The maid turned abruptly from the mirror, her feet in sneakers moving across the floor towards the electric outlet. If she disconnected the vacuum cleaner, there would be no experiment. If Ralph was going to pit one motor against the other, he had to do it now. He would never have another chance. Ralph picked up his tail and started the motor. Without taking time to let it warm up, he gunned it with all the breath he could inhale. The motorcycle got off to a faster start than Ralph expected, so fast that Ralph lost control. He shot out from under the bed just as the vacuum cleaner died with a long, drawn-out groan. Suddenly, everything went white, and Ralph found himself bumping along in a strange, ghostly place all white and made of cloth that seemed to be closing in on him in every direction. Ralph had ridden straight into a pillowcase thrown into a heap of laundry the maid had dropped on the floor, and the opening of the pillowcase had fallen shut behind him. Ralph had no idea which way was out. He dismounted from the motorcycle and beat at the cloth with his fists, but everywhere he struck it, it was soft and yielding. He stamped his feet only to have the cloth give softly and silently beneath him. He began to wade through the pillowcase, tugging the motorcycle behind him, while he wondered why he had thought it was so important to test the motorcycle against the vacuum cleaner. The light, filtered through unknown layers of cloth, was dim, and he sank to his knees in bed linen in every step. When he came to the seam, he knew he'd been wading in the wrong direction. "Drat," muttered Ralph. He turned, still dragging the motorcycle, and tried to retrace his footsteps, only to find he had no idea which way he had come. There were no landmarks. The clouds of cloth were white, billowy, and yielding in all directions. Double drat! He stamped his foot, only to find himself sinking deeper into the linen. From the swooshing sounds he could hear outside, Ralph knew that the maid must be unfolding clean sheets over the bed. He plodded on, dragging the motorcycle, without direction and with very little hope. "He promised to buy me a bunch of blue ribbons," sang the maid, "to tie up my bonny brown hair." Down the hall, a door opened. Ralph heard a muffled woof, and in a moment the click of small dog's toenails on the bare floor at the edge of the hall carpet, followed by sniffing that was dangerously close. The little terrier began to bark. "I know you're in there," he yipped. "Stick out your tongue and waggle your fingers at me, will you? You just wait." Paws began to scrape at the sheets and the pillowcases as if the dog was trying to dig a hole. Ralph decided it was wiser not to talk back to the dog. He huddled, scarcely breathing, against the motorcycle. "Well, hello, you cute little thing," said the maid, revealing to Ralph that she was even sillier than he thought. As if there was anything cute about a terrier that could scarcely see through his own hair. The dog began yapping very self-consciously, Ralph thought, now that he knew he was being admired by the maid. The man's steps came thudding down the hall. "Stop your racket, you pesky mutt," said the owner's voice, and Ralph knew when the barks came suddenly came from above him that the dog had been snatched up. "Let me down and I'll dig him out," yapped the dog as he was carried away. "Just let me down for 1 minute and I'll show you." Suddenly, Ralph felt himself being tumbled about in the pillowcase. He did not even have to think what to do. He automatically grabbed the motorcycle and held on with all his strength. Even though he'd been tipped upside down with his feet in the air, Ralph knew that he was being lifted up inside a bundle of bed linen and carried down the hall. He lay still, his front paws locked around the front wheel of the motorcycle, waiting to see what would happen next. The maid walked a short distance to what Ralph judged to be the linen room, and there she dumped her armload of bedding before she went off to clean another room. Ralph was deep in the hamper where no light filtered through it all. These sheets and pillowcases were on their way to the laundry, and since he had no wish to be laundered any more than he had wished to be thrown out in the trash, there was only one thing for him to do: start chewing. Ralph ripped into the pillowcase with his sharp teeth, and in no time he'd made a ragged hole, which he climbed through. When he tried to pull the motorcycle after him, he discovered the hole was too small. He had to stop and chew it bigger before he could pull the machine along with him. Ralph chewed through another layer of cloth, and then another as he worked his way upward, each time enlarging the hole for the motorcycle. His jaw began to ache, and still another layer of cloth lay ahead. this time a damp bath towel, which made for slow chewing. Ralph was forced to make a decision. Did he want to save his life? Did he want to be carried off in the laundry with the motorcycle? There was only one answer. He wanted to save his life. He must abandon the motorcycle. With aching jaws, Ralph chewed onward and upward, moving faster now that he was making mouse-sized holes instead of motorcycle-sized holes. The bath towel had left an unpleasant, furry taste in his mouth. Gradually, light began to filter through the cloth until finally, when Ralph thought he could not force his jaws to close over one more mouthful of fiber, he emerged into the daylight at the top of the hamper. Phew! Ralph gasped, rubbing his aching jaws and wading across the sheets at the edge of the hamper. He leaped lightly to the floor and hugged the baseboard, scurrying down the hall to room 215, where he flattened himself and squeezed under the door. Safe, but exhausted and filled with remorse at the loss of Keith's motorcycle, Ralph dragged himself off to the mouse hole to catch up on the sleep he should have had that day. Chapter 8. A Family Reunion. The next thing Ralph knew, his mother was shaking him by the shoulder. "Wake up!" she said. "Ralph, wake up! Room service has brought us another meal!" Room service? Ralph rubbed his eyes, not believing what he'd heard. Room service has brought our dinner? Yes, a real feast. A whole blueberry muffin and a chocolate chip cookie, said Ralph's mother. "Get up! We're having a family reunion." It all came back to Ralph. "Oh, room service," he said, understanding at last. "You mean the boy Keith. He is room service to me." Ralph's mother sounded happy and carefree. Ralph sat up. Already his aunts and uncles and many squeaky cousins had been arriving by secret paths in the space between the walls. It was a long time since anyone had had enough food for a family reunion, and there was rejoicing in the mouse nest for everyone but Ralph. He was thinking of the motorcycle he had lost and the promise he had broken. He had a dull, heavy feeling in the pit of his stomach, and he did not feel like celebrating. "Why, there's Ralph!" squeaked his Aunt Sissy, who thought she was better than the rest of the family because she lived in the bridal suite where, she led her relatives to believe, riches of rice fell to the carpet when the bride shook off her hat and the groom shook out his coat. The rest of the family knew Aunt Sissy was not as grand as she pretended to be, because very few brides and grooms came to the hotel these days. "My, how you've grown!" Ralph did not know what to say when people told him how much he'd grown. "Well, well, if it isn't Ralph!" said Uncle Lester, who had a nest inside the wall of the housekeeper's office, where the maids dropped donut crumbs every morning at 10 o'clock when they had their coffee. "What's this I hear about you riding up and down the halls on a motorcycle?" Uncle Lester had a way of saying the wrong thing at the wrong time. "My land, a motorcycle," said old Aunt Dorothy. "Isn't that pretty dangerous?" "Wouldn't mind riding one myself if I was a few years younger," said Uncle Ralph. All the cousins were crowding around Ralph. "Show us your motorcycle," they squeaked. "We want to ride it. Come on, give us a ride on your motorcycle, Ralph. Huh, Ralph? Come on, Ralph, please." Ralph knew he was expected to be polite to all his relatives, even the squeaky little cousins. Well, embarrassed and ashamed, he looked at the floor. "I sort of lost the motorcycle in a pile of sheets and pillowcases." "Lost the motorcycle? Oh, Ralph!" cried his mother, genuinely alarmed. Ralph knew what she was thinking. Did that mean the end of room service? Did she have to go back to pilfering crumbs for his brothers and sisters? "That's a young mouse for you," said tactless Uncle Lester. "Can't take care of anything." "If anybody asks me, I think it's a good thing he lost it," said Aunt Dorothy. "Riding a motorcycle is just plain foolhardy." All the cousins looked disappointed and sulky. "I don't think he ever had a motorcycle," said one. "I bet he made it up," said the others, and the rest agreed. Ralph felt terrible. The family reunion swirled on around him. The muffin and the cookie were divided. Cousins fought over the blueberries. Uncles, usually overweight uncles, asked for second helpings. Everyone talked at once. The little cousins finished their dinner and went racing around the mouse nest. The aunts and uncles raised their voices to be heard over the racket that their children made. Then suddenly, it came from the knothole, a noise that drowned out the squeaks and squeals of the young mice at play. Shh! Not a mouse moved. They looked at one another, too terrified to speak. "Psst, "Hey, Ralph, come on out," whispered Keith at the entrance of the mouse nest. Ralph's mother gave him a little shove, but no one spoke. And with heavy feet, Ralph walked to the knothole, but he did not go out into room 215. "What do you want?" he asked. "You and your family better be quiet in there, or my mother will hear you. You know how she is about mice," Keith said. "I don't know why people say things are quiet as mice. You seem pretty loud to me." Behind Ralph, his relatives began to tiptoe quietly away to their own homes, leaving his mother to do all the cleaning up. "Did you have a nice picnic?" Ralph asked, dreading what he must tell the boy. "Yeah, we went to an old mining town with a real jail with bars on the window and everything." Keith reached into his pocket and pulled out something curved and hard and white with a rubber band fastened to it with a piece of Scotch tape. "I brought you a present. Come on out." Puzzled and confused, Ralph squeezed through the knothole. "What is it?" he asked. Whatever the object was, he had never seen anything like it. "Half a ping-pong ball I found down in the game room," said Keith. "See, I padded the inside with thistledown and anchored it to a rubber band on top with Scotch tape." "What's it for?" Ralph didn't understand. "It's a crash helmet for you." Keith set half a ping-pong ball on Ralph's head and slipped the rubber band carefully around his whiskers until it rested under his chin. "There, that's just right. You need it big so there's plenty of room for your ears, and when you ride the motorcycle, you need a crash helmet." Ralph peered at Keith from under his new crash helmet, which rested lightly on his head. He knew he looked every inch a motorcycle racer, but not in his whole life had he ever felt so ashamed. He longed to crawl off to his hole and never face Keith again, but his conscience, which until now he didn't know he had, would not let him. There was nothing to do but stand there in his fine new crash helmet and confess. "You might as well know," he said to Keith. "I lost the motorcycle." "Lost the motorcycle?" Keith, who'd been kneeling down, sat back on his heels. "But how?" "I rode it by mistake into a pillowcase in a heap of linen on the floor, and it got dumped into the laundry hamper," confessed Ralph. "You rode into a pillowcase," repeated Keith. "But you weren't supposed to be riding it in the daytime. You promised." "I know," agreed Ralph miserably. "I didn't exactly mean to ride it. But you see, the maid was vacuuming under the bed and I," began Ralph, and then stopped. "Oh, what's the use? I rode it and I lost it, and it's probably going to the laundry by now, and I'm sorry." The boy and the mouse were silent. Both were thinking about the little motorcycle with its clean lines and a pair of shining chromium exhaust pipes. "That motorcycle was my very most favorite of all my cars," said Keith. "I saved all my allowance and bought it myself." Ralph hung his head in his crash helmet. There was nothing more he could say. It was terrible what he had done. "I guess I should have known you weren't old enough to be trusted with a motorcycle," said Keith. The boy could not have said anything that would hurt Ralph any more. All right, friends, I will see you tomorrow for chapters 9 and 10. Till then, see you later.